Hi, thanks for this CARI think tanks conversation. This is the first broadcast with Dr. Michael Fullilove, the Executive Director of the Lowy Institute of Australia, and Francisco de Santibañes, Secretary General of the Argentine Council for International Relations. Thanks for being here.
Hi, Michael. Thank you, Guillermo.
Hey, Francisco, nice to see your face.
Nice to see you too.
I wish we were doing this over a coffee in Recoleta in Buenos Aires, but this is almost as good.
Next time, either at Sydney or in Recoleta.
Okay. I don't know what you think, Francisco, but to my mind, coronavirus is like a stress test on countries, and some are doing well and some are doing poorly. And in my observation, the biggest powers to which we normally look for leadership and inspiration are not doing well. The United States obviously looks very unimpressive and mediocre. The president's own leadership has been very poor, but I think the country in general has also not responded well, and it sort of points to weaknesses in that society, in the healthcare system, lack of state capacity, excessive partisanship, and now, of course, on top of the coronavirus, and then on top of the economic depression, they now have this awful situation, the riots arising from this act of violence against the African-American man. And again, we see a poor response from the Trump administration. So I can't remember a time in a lifetime really of watching America when I've been so sad and angry at how your neighbor to the north looks weakened.
Yes, I agree. I think that we are starting to see a dispute between two different narratives, no? Because you can make the argument, of course, that the US has not done well during this crisis, but there is also the argument that China was responsible at the beginning of the crisis not to provide information fast enough for the international community. So I think we have to understand the coronavirus in relation with the big powers in terms that this is not going to change everything, but it's accelerating some trends that we were already observing in the international order. No? One of those is nationalism. We see this in the rhetoric, not only of Trump, in the opposition from the Americans towards China after the coronavirus among the population. We are also seeing this from the side of the Chinese. We are observing also the growing weakness of international institutions. That this was already a trend, but I think it's very important, the decision of the US to leave the World Health Organization. And lastly, maybe more important, I think that it's clear that we're moving towards a different kind of international system with two big powers. There is a discussion. I don't know, what do you think about that? Some people think we're moving towards a multipolar war. Others think we're moving towards a bipolar war with the United States and China as the big powers. I think in the way states are acting, it's becoming clear that we're starting to live in an international order with two big countries, no? The most powerful countries. And as you mentioned, have heard you many times, this has an effect at the level of the liberal order we have been living, especially after the Cold War, but also in how we preserve a rule-based order. I think that's a key point for Australia, for Argentina, and for middle-sized countries.
Yeah, I agree with what you say. I think that, I said earlier, I think the United States has had a bad case of coronavirus. But you talked about different narratives. One of the narratives about China that has been around for the last few months is that China will do well out of coronavirus because it showed such state capacity in checking the spread of the virus. and because its economy will come out of recession earlier than anyone else's. And I'm a skeptic of that argument. I think that China will also have a very bad case of coronavirus for a long time, because I think ultimately that the same system that showed state capacity in responding to the virus was the same system that covered it up and allowed it to disperse from Wuhan to the world. So I think this will have a big impact on China's attractiveness, its prestige, its soft power. So I think both the United States and China have been negatively affected by the pandemic, as has Europe. And so I wouldn't quite concur that coronavirus has just magnified existing trends. To some extent it has. In another way, it's created a new dynamic where these big states that we thought were so impressive, and I'm sure you're right, are the two most powerful countries in the world, nevertheless are not countries that are appealing to most people around the world. Increasingly, they are less appealing. On your other points, I think that the coronavirus has certainly led to a rise of or an increased focus on the nation state as the key unit of analysis in the international system. And it's natural, it's sort of human nature probably, that we fall back on our own nation, on our own president or prime minister. We look to our own capital, Buenos Aires or to Canberra. We're not looking to New York to hear what the UN Secretary General has to say. But I also think there are limits to that. And I think that coronavirus won't be solved without international cooperation. The international economic crisis won't be ameliorated without cooperation. A vaccine won't be found. International travel won't restart. So in many ways, international cooperation is more important, not less important, because of this pandemic. And that's why I think the response of the Trump administration to withdraw from the WHO is really the wrong approach for countries, in the minds of countries like ours, democracies who want liberal values to be evident in international institutions. We shouldn't be stepping back from them. We should be stepping forward into them. The final point I'd make is you were saying, what does it all mean for countries like Argentina and Australia that have an interest in a global order but don't have the capacity to shape the global order? I think we need, whether it ends up in a bipolar power structure or a multipolar one, in either circumstance, the right answer for countries like Argentina and Australia is for us to do more, to be more active, to invest in our own capacities, because these big countries will ultimately look after their interests first. And we need to, I'm a big supporter of the US alliance, but at the same time, we can help to shape the developing order.
Yes, I totally agree. I think maybe a last comment about this topic, great powers, is this is going to affect domestic politics, no? I think this is especially the case in the US. The economic crisis is an important one. So not just in terms of the general election in November, where this is going to help or hurt Trump, but as the 2008 economic crisis have maybe a bigger impact in the long term in terms of nationalism, more conservative, more populist governments around the world. This crisis may have a profound effect both in Chinese and in American society, and eventually that's going to translate in politics and in foreign policy. We are not sure where that's going to take us, but some of the first, of the first signs, it seems that we're going towards a even more nationalistic scenario, no? And two examples, no? The Japanese government providing incentives to their companies to not to produce anymore in China, come back home. One of the few supporters of the liberal order, as Macron in France, also changing his speech and talking about the necessity of having some autonomy in key economic industries that relate to national security. So I think we have to take care also about pay attention to the social changes, that this is going to take more time, but I think it will have a profound effect in both
I agree.
superpowers.
Yeah, and I mean, just quickly, because I know we have to end on this topic, I think your book on these issues was very prescient. So congratulations on that. One point I'd make very quickly is there's a big difference between the United States and China, and that is that the United States is democracy and China is not. And so the United States has a chance to course correct in November. And if they vote President Trump out and they vote Vice President Biden into the White House, then you may see a much more normal, traditional style of domestic politics as well as foreign policy. The Chinese people don't have that opportunity to kick out Xi Jinping. The Chinese Communist Party its first and last focus is regime continuity. So those sorts of, that phenomenon you're talking about of increasing nationalism, we rely on the leadership itself. That's quite worrying, I think.
Of what middle power should do, and I consider maybe for sure Australia, but also Argentina, Brazil, Mexico as members of this group. I agree with what Michael said before. It's key maybe to form a coalition of middle-sized countries to promote multilateralism. No? That because maybe the liberal order is threatened by the changes that are taking place, especially the rivalry between China and the US. But that doesn't mean that we should lose the rules that protect mainly the interests of the middle-sized and small countries. So I think that's key. But also I think we should think in different ways than in the past, no? Because things are changing in the system, things are changing in domestic politics. We are moving toward a different kind of government. So I don't know if Michael agrees with this, but I think that forums like the G20 that doesn't need for governments to surrender autonomy in certain way in some key issues, don't create the rejection that some more nationalistic leaders may feel toward the United Nations, the other international organizations may play a more important role in future years. No, this is a place where leaders get together, discuss, reduce uncertainties, and I think make collaboration possible in a very difficult time.
I think that there's strength in numbers. I agree with you on that. And the more we can work together to reinforce the rules that make our lives easier and fairer, the better. And Australia's had an example just in the last month of how difficult it is to go it alone. Because as you know, Francisco, Australia helped to lead the call for an independent international investigation into the origins of the coronavirus pandemic. Now, you and I might think that is a very reasonable demand, given that the pandemic has killed nearly 500,000 people and it will cause untold economic suffering. But of course, Beijing didn't like that at all. And we've had a very choppy period in our bilateral relationship with China, in which the Chinese ambassador here in Australia threatened a consumer boycott. We had Chinese diplomats turning up at ministerial press conferences, and we've had what appear to be sanctions enforced against some of tariffs imposed, I should say, on some of Australia's exports to China. So, to your point about how do middle powers relate to these great powers, The answer is they don't like it when we stand up for ourselves or when we poke the bear. And China in particular is very assertive, very aggressive at the moment. And so I think that means that the more that we can work together, recently Australia went together with a number of other countries, the Brits and the Canadians, to make a statement on Hong Kong. That's one example of banding together. Another example could be through the G20, as you say, although, as you know, the G20 has kind of lost altitude in recent years. So some of us are losing our faith in G20, but we need to definitely think of ways and vessels and mediums and forums that we can use to thicken the connections between our countries, to complicate the world for the big powers so they can't rule it by fiat.
I totally agree, and sometimes an easy solution is very difficult to apply, and that's the idea that we can maintain, for example, good economic relations with China while preserving our political military links with the US, for example. But the problem with that is that only works if both China and the US likes that scenario. If any of those powers doesn't like that scenario, that strategy is not possible. And in that sense, I think getting closer, building bridges between our countries that are facing similar challenges all over the world. We're talking about Latin America, Australia, but also Europe, the UK, African countries. Everything that helps to build these bridges between states and civil society, that's also important. I think will be key. Other important thing, in my view, is to strengthen regional alliance. For example, in South America, Argentina and Brazil. If that alliance that now is threatened because of ideological difference between governments, the conflictivity could move towards our region. And the same with Europe. I think the European Union made some mistakes, but play a major role bringing peace and stability to Europe. And behind that alliance is the relation between Germany and France. So I think working in favor of multilateralism through a coalition between middle-sized countries and preserving and strengthening the regional alliance could play an important role in the new system.
Well, I agree with that, and you could add, of course, the region of Asia to the list of regions that you mentioned. And in Asia, we sometimes sometimes shrink Asia to the dimensions of China. But in fact, there are many countries in Asia, a number of large countries, India, Japan, Vietnam, Indonesia, and all these countries have their own interests and their own, they all want to preserve their autonomy. None of us wants to live in the shadow of another state. Now in Asia, the state that troubles most people or most countries is China. And most Asian countries don't want to live in China's shadow. And that's why most Asian countries like the idea of a United States that remains engaged in Asia. They may not agree with everything the Americans say, but they like the idea of a United States in the region because it provides some balance and some structure to the forces in the region. And what we also need to do, as well as keeping the United States engaged in Asia, is we need to do more with each other. Australia should be doing more with India this week. The two prime ministers of India and Australia are having a virtual summit, which will be interesting. We need to do more with Japan, with Indonesia, with Vietnam. We all need to do more things together, not as a way of containing China, because of course, Japan's interests or India's interests in relation to China are very different from ours, but rather as a way of complicating the region, adding some ballast to it, because we need to fill the zone. If we quit the field, then it's very easy for it just to be a bipolar struggle in Asia, or even worse, domination by China. It's much better for the rest of us if we're all engaged, saying, no, this is our part of the world too, and we all have interests to protect, we have values to project, and we're going to do that with the big powers, but also with other mid-sized powers.
Yes, I agree totally. And my last comment will be, this coalition, this multilateralism will help a lot to preserve some subjects that may be threatened by the bipolarity, no? And they should continue to be in the agenda. I'm talking about health, talking about coordination of fiscal and monetary policies to avoid future economic crises, talking about protectionism. And these are all subjects that maybe the interests of the big powers are different to ours, especially to smaller countries. And one of the goals, as you mentioned, is to preserve autonomy, to avoid domination, but also to preserve these subjects, to keep them alive, fighting against global warming, for example, another big issue that is in danger of not being in the global agenda anymore.
We're going to have to find a subject to disagree on, Francisco. Well, on the subject of new groupings, of course, we have a suggestion from the president. President Trump has cancelled the upcoming G7 meeting, and he's proposed an expanded G7, which includes Australia and India and South Korea and Russia, but doesn't include China. I think this is positive in that it shows that some of these groupings are fluid, and I think all of us would agree that many of these international groupings are a bit outdated. They need to be updated. It's definitely positive from the Australian perspective, and I'll be unashamed about that. Australians are joiners by instinct, and so my advice to the Australian government is jump on this suggestion, because if this is an opportunity to get inside an expanded G7, that is obviously in Australia's interests. But I would say, caveat emptor, buyer beware. I would say be cautious to the Australian government, because this idea does come from President Trump. Usually everything President Trump touches turns to mud. This has a sort of an anti-China element at the heart of it, but also a pro-Russian element. I see already that other traditional G7 countries have said they won't accept Russia into this expanded group in light of Russia's annexation of Crimea, and of course the Russian flag still flies over Simferopol in Crimea. So I think it's an interesting development. I'd be surprised if it goes ahead, because things are changing so quickly in the United States, and this feels quite a political offer. But from an Australian point of view, my suggestion to the Australian government is seize the opportunity, even if it's flawed.
Right. Well, from our Argentine position, I would take a position in favor of G20, of course, that has Argentina as a member, but also other important countries like Mexico, Brazil, African nations. But the main problem with that possibility, in my view, is that it excludes China. And to solve any of the problems we have talked about, you need to have in the table the big ones. No? And the big ones are the US and China. You won't solve the global warming, protectionism, terrorism, and all the problems we have in international agenda without the presence of China. So from a realist perspective and from an Argentine perspective, I think we have to strengthen the G20. I think this really is the best way to go forward. But maybe for some last comments, thinking about the future, I'm pretty sure that the world we got to know after the Cold War, it's over. No? A liberal order with 3 pillars: the promotion of liberal democracy, globalization as we knew it, and strong international institutions may not come back. But that doesn't mean that we have to live in a world without rules that protects the interest of middle-sized countries like ours. So the future is not brightened. I think we have to play a major role of middle-sized countries in building a diplomatic coalition, as we mentioned before, and we have to do it quickly, as fast as possible, because as you mentioned, if there is a vacuum, the big powers will fill it, and that's going to be bad for us and for the big powers and the international community.
Well, I see that after a moment of disagreement, we're back on the same page, Francisco. I agree with you. I'd say, first of all, rules matter. And rules matter especially for countries that can't coerce everyone else into doing what we want them to do. And you're right that we can't just preserve an order that was established in the 1940s. That's not going to work. But the interests of all countries are promoted when the rules of the road are widely understood and widely observed. And when the rules of the road are not followed, then that's tough for the normal motorists like Argentina and Australia. So I agree with you on that point. Secondly, I think that we have to do everything within our power to promulgate, to enforce, to expand those rules. And that means a different mindset for countries like ours. You know, we're used to seeing each other, we're used to seeing ourselves, I think, certainly in the case of Australia, as an onlooker or a cheerleader. And we're sort of standing over there on the sidelines watching what the players are doing. But if we're going to have a chance in this new game, we have to get on the field. And we can't be filled with self-doubt, and equally we have to get beyond some of the sort of traditional rivalries where we are so focused on our neighbours, for example, that we don't see the bigger picture, because the bigger picture matters. But all of us, I think, are going to have to think differently, and all of us are going to have to think big. The final point I'll make is that the coronavirus, I think, is changing people's mental map. It's changing the way they think about the world, and it's changing the way they think about success and successful countries. To go back to the point that I started on, that, you know, we've as international relations analysts, we always think about the summit, and we think about the big powers that determine whether it's at Yalta or at summits over the years, Tehran, various summits. We think of the world order being created by great powers, and to some extent that remains because they have the power to draw the map. But what we have seen in coronavirus is that leadership and inspiration has often come from smaller countries. It hasn't come from the large countries, which all in their own way have been disappointments during the coronavirus pandemic. And in many cases, it's smaller countries, more nimble countries that have done a little bit better for their people. So that's a positive lesson I think we can take, that this world belongs to Argentina and Australia, just as it does to the United States and China and these big powers, Russia. We have some lessons to teach the world. We have some capacities that are interesting. We have some magnetic appeal, whether it's Argentine football or Australian wildlife. We have some things that are appealing to the world. We have an attitude that the world likes, and we need to take advantage of that, I think. And I think the world is more receptive. I think the world is looking at what's happening in other countries much more closely than any other time in my adult life. What's happening in South Korea, what's happening in Taiwan or New Zealand. So there is an opportunity for us to take advantage of this change and to provide a bit of leadership and inspiration ourselves.
And one last point from my part is that this relation between countries like the Latin American states and Australia are also very important for us, because Australia already has experience of dealing with these subjects, strategic matters. We have been far away from the main conflicts for many decades. That's one thing we have to learn from Australian experience. And the other is that in certain way we are not ready to face these challenges because our institutions are not strong enough. So that there is also a lot to learn about public policy, not just foreign policy, of what our countries have done in the last years, and thinking about the future. But we can continue this conversation, Michael, when you are back in Argentina.
Well, I'm concluding that there's a need for a lot of strong Australian-Argentine cooperation, which will no doubt involve some fact-finding missions to Buenos Aires and Sydney. I certainly hope so. And in the meantime, Francisco, we have to think big and go River Plate.
Muy bien, Michael.
Thanks both of you to be part of this first broadcast of CARI Think Tank's conversation. And thanks again, Francisco and Michael.
Thank you.
Thank you, Guillermo.